So I chose to do my project over youth trauma, specifically the service system crossover. So crossover youth are youth who have experienced both maltreatment and have been involved in delinquent or criminal behavior, which has brought them in contact with both CPS and the juvenile justice system. And this is important because these youth are experiencing higher levels of trauma and adversities that are putting them at disadvantage, are making them more disadvantaged than other people in our societies, or in our society. So the child welfare system is designed to protect the welfare of children by investigating cases of neglect or abuse. These are usually referrals from outside the family home. And they try to first preserve the family unit by providing the community interventions and skill development for the parents in order to reduce that neglect and abuse, and also so that they can understand the importance of their behavior in their child's development. Then second option to keeping the natural family together is separation of the family and moving the child to a much safer environment, whether that be a foster home, group home, another person within the family. And then some characteristics of these children. So while there are children of all ages within the juvenile or within the criminal, within CPS, within the child welfare system, as we have learned in class, youth who are 3 and under are a lot more vulnerable to these neglects and trauma, or these neglect and abuse. It's a lot more traumatizing and detrimental to their development, as during these years we learn how to control our emotions, we had learned to find comfort in other people, we learn how to perceive the world, etc. Also, there's an even split between boys and girls pretty much being involved in the child welfare system, but unfortunately Native Americans and African Americans by their race population are more likely to be referred to and involved with the child welfare system. And then some risk factors that these youth are experiencing are drug and alcohol abuse, single-headed households, and poverty, which all will tie back into the juvenile justice system characteristics as well. So obviously with drug and alcohol abuse and then poverty, youth experience adversities. They don't have the greatest family support systems or family backgrounds. They experience threats to their lives, to their safety, and to the safety of their loved ones. And then also violent environment exposure, as we know, as poverty goes up, crime rates go up because there's a lack of access to resources, which makes kids and their families a lot more vulnerable to criminal behavior, which will tie into the juvenile justice system and juvenile recidivism later in this presentation. But then also within CPS, as I said before, there's in-home and out-of-home care. When a child is removed from their home, it causes a whole nother level of adversity and trauma. When you don't have we know what it's like to not have, our loved ones with us. We know what it's like to, even as college students, to be separated from them and how that affects our mental health, etc. So a statistic that stood out to me was that 92% of all youth that are within the juvenile justice system first came into contact with CPS. So before I jump into why the statistic is so important, I just want to give some overview of the juvenile justice system and juvenile recidivism. So the juvenile justice system, they understand the fundamental differences between a child and an adult and why they commit criminal behaviors. So with the juvenile justice system, they have a focus on youth skill development, and then also addressing treatment needs, which was missing and lacking in all of my research on CPS, unfortunately. And their overall goal is just to reintegrate these youth back into society successfully. and obviously to reduce juvenile recidivism. But juvenile recidivism is definitely still a thing, which is just the going in and out of the juvenile justice system on multiple occasions. So some predictors of juvenile recidivism are male gender, early age, status offenses, DSM diagnoses, diagnoses by the school, being removed from your family, and then also just referral to CPS. One thing I'd like to point out is that male gender is on here, even though 92% of these youth come from CPS, and CPS is evenly distributed between males and females. Males are still more likely to behave delinquently and interact with juvenile recidivism. So how could CPS possibly be be involved in this increase of juvenile recidivism in youth? So I did a lot of research on group home placements, which is usually what I've interpreted as is like the last resort for youth in this system before they reach the juvenile justice system permanently. Unfortunately, it's usually males, and they all have behavioral and emotional issues. And within these homes, there's this thing called delinquency training, which is just the reinforcement by your peers that you're delinquent and criminal behavior is normal and okay, unfortunately. And with that, we know that would increase the likelihood of aggressive and delinquent behavior because you think it's normal, everyone's doing it. But then also the experience of maltreatment in general, which all kids that come into contact with CPS have experienced, leads to delinquent ways of coping. So we've learned about triggers, things that trigger kids that have experienced trauma, and then also they're more likely to experience and be involved with drug and alcohol, which is obviously very detrimental to their development as youth. Their brains are still developing, and drug and alcohol only stunts that growth and development. So what's currently being done, so I found this research project by Branson, and they were looking at trauma-informed juvenile justice system quotas and the policies and practices that different systems were trying to implement, and they came up with 10 different policies and practices. The most important, which has already been being implemented, is the collaboration between the crossover systems. So this is called the crossover youth practice model, and this is trying to reduce the interaction that maltreated youth have with the juvenile justice system. And to do so, they try again to collaborate and communicate between these two systems, because if a youth comes into contact with a police officer, it's a lot better for that police officer to understand, well, I come from poverty. My mom, she abuses alcohol or drugs. I've been abused, X, Y, and Z, and that's why I'm acting this way. And we can better treat these youth, which goes into the second point of earlier and individualized intervention. Understanding that once they hit CPS, it's more than just removing that child from a unsafe environment. It's more than just teaching the parents. There's already damage that's been done to the youth, and we need to approach that. We need to address that. And then lastly is increased family engagement. Again, youth being removed from their family isn't always the best option. It doesn't always mean that it's going to improve their situation, and sometimes keeping the family involved is going to help the youth a lot more. So with that being said, crossover youth experience a lot more trauma and adversities, which put them at a disadvantage in society already. And then thus we need collaboration between these two systems, because we need to understand what's going on with these youth. We need to understand what has happened. How has this impacted the way you're acting now? And how can we show you that that these certain situations don't mean danger? And then that's the only way we can increase the rehabilitation of youth into our societies, is through understanding their trauma and treating it appropriately.